Dr. Mary Murphy. Mary is pretty well known, the author of many books and papers herself. Jack Shanker is a journalist, an author, a journalist with the Guardian newspaper. Jack delivered the TASC lecture here a couple of years ago, so we're very glad to welcome him back again. My name is David Begg. I'm a member of the board of TASC. So let me start off just by making a few opening remarks. First of all, I've known Peadar for a good many years, and he's a man to whom I owe an extraordinary intellectual debt. And the reason is that about 15 years ago, we were together at a social event, and we were, just by one of those strange coincidences, sitting side by side during a fairly lengthy dinner. And we got talking about the state of the world, and in the course of the conversation, he introduced me to the work of Karl Polanyi, about whom I have to admit that I had lived quite a long life without ever hearing about Polanyi up to that point, and his famous book, The Great Transformation. Now, about Polanyi, for those who don't know about him, he's Hungarian born. He was an anthropologist and a sociologist. He became a journalist and newspaper editor in Vienna in the 1930s. But because of the rise of the Nazi party, he was really obliged to leave that position, and he emigrated to England, where he began to work with the Workers' Educational Association. And later he went to Bennington College in the United States, in Vermont in the United States, which is where he wrote his magnum opus, The Great Transformation. And Fred Bloch has described it as the single best critique of market liberalism that has ever existed. He was a complex mixture, Polanyi. He agreed largely with Keynes' critique of market liberalism, but he said he wasn't a Keynesian per se. He was also a socialist, or so he admitted, and he was very sympathetic to Marx, but he actually didn't agree with the concept of economic determinism in a Marxist sense. So he's complex, and I suppose the difficulty of it is this, that when he wrote the book, his intention was to try and influence the post-war international order. But the complexity of it and the advent of the Cold War meant to some extent, I think, that his work didn't get the attention probably that it should have done. Now, the Great Transformation is based on three core theses that Polanyi outlined. First of all, that labor, land, and money are fictitious commodities, not things that can or should be normally traded in a market sense. And from that, of course, a very significant view, because from that, he was able to really prove, I suppose, that a lot of the economic theorizing that goes on based on those elements being commodities is actually based on sand. It is not sound theorizing at all. The second thesis was that the economy should always and everywhere be embedded in social relations and not the other way around, as you know, is or has been the case for some time now. And I'll talk about that in a second. But a great metaphor for this is that it's like an elastic band. If you pull it and stretch it too much in this particular way, by trying to locate the society and the economy rather than the other way, that it will eventually break, or forces will come into play which will bring it back to a more balanced position. And the third thesis was that what he called the double movement, that eventually people, workers, you know, will push back against the market forces oppressing them and insist and force on getting change in order to have a more civilized way of living. Now, I suppose that the interesting thing is that in the post-war period, the polity was largely Keynesian up to the 1970s. And Milton Friedman then, who would have used the polar opposite of Polanyi. Milton Friedman was a disciple of Hayek, and Hayek wrote the Road to Serfdom around the same time that The Great Transformation was published. But Friedman wrote an article, I should say, in the New York Times in 1970, just 13th of September 1970, just over 50 years ago, which effectively set about to deconstruct the New Deal. of the post-war settlement. What he essentially said really was that the business of business is to make profit and nothing else. And after that article in the New York Times, that particular point of view spread like wildfire right around the world. It was taken up energetically by business and indeed proselytized by many journalists and also by business schools. And the net result of that has been the nearly 5 decades of neoliberalism that we have lived through. Now, I think the experience of the 2008 financial crisis seriously undermined that, and it has been in decline ever since. But as Gramsci kind of said at one stage, the old order is dying, but what will replace it is not yet clear. Now, here we come to what I think is the great value of Peadar's book. Peadar recovers the theoretical foundational work of Polanyi and applies it to our current situation. And it's extraordinary to think, that most books really have a shelf life of 3 or 4 years at most. Polanyi's work has survived and is still extraordinarily relevant nearly 80 years later, particularly as a theoretical grounding for the challenges we face. And Peadar outlines in the book what some of those challenges are. First of all, to understand the interrelationship between markets and states and civil society in circumstances where we are on the cusp of an unprecedented second, if you like, great transition based on multifaceted breakdown of society and in the context of climate risk and biodiversity loss. And President Michael D. Higgins, in a foreword to the book, makes the point that we are standing on an existential precipice, which is a very good way to describe it. And that is the great value of Peadar's work to make Polanyi relevant to the current situation that we're facing. So I'm very much looking forward now to hearing Peadar outline the book, and he will take about 15 to 20 minutes to do that, and he will use some slides to help us to understand what he is about. So Peadar, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much, David. Just let me bring up the slides here and so I hope everybody can see those. So just as I begin, I'd like to, first of all, take a moment to thank TASC, particularly Shanna Cohen and Rob Sweeney, for agreeing to host this seminar on the book, and to our speakers, David Begg, as I say, I have this constant memory of him thanking me for introducing him to Polanyi, so I'm delighted he confirmed that for me as we spoke earlier this morning, and I'm delighted to have him here because, of course, his work and his background has so much to bring to the discussion about where we're going. Mary Murphy, my good friend, and somebody out of the discussions with whom I have benefited greatly, and they're reflected in this book very much. I'm delighted it has accepted an invitation really to do a bit of a review of the book after I've introduced it. And then Jack Schenker, one of the, to me, the most insightful person documenting the emergence of the politics of the people, as he calls it today, in Britain and in other parts of the world, is going to be available, and he's going to give his reflections at the end on our discussion. So to start off, I wanted to say that this isn't a book on Polanyi. This is a book using Polanyi to try to understand the crisis of our times and where we go. What is the alternative? If I had my way, the title and the subtitle would be inverted. That's the way I wanted it, but publishers have a way of insisting on what their market people tell them will work. And in the first chapter, I identify what I call the 6 elements of system breakdown that we're facing today, all of them reinforcing one another. So the unraveling of the social model, the erosion of political representation with the rise of the new populism, the tendency very strong now of blaming the outsider, immigrants, people of different ethnic origin or sexual orientation, the reemergence of conspiracy theories, really frightening evidence of that in recent times. Then there's the dark sides of technology, automation and the loss of jobs, but also the emergence of artificial intelligence and the power of algorithms. And then, of course, behind all that is the existential and final and ultimate threat of climate change and biodiversity loss, which for so long we have minimized, and now suddenly, very late in the day, we're facing up to it as a fundamental threat to the future of humanity itself. And then coming back to the more personal level, there is a crisis of what I call in the book personal impotence. There's a global mental health crisis, according to a Lancet commission that was set up to study that. And George Monbiot talks about our time as an age of loneliness. There's a lot of evidence to back that up. So more and more people are asking, now, when will the collapse come? There's a whole section in my book where I document some of this discussion. And yet, what strikes me so strongly is that so many of these threats to our livelihood, to our society, are being debated in what seem like separate universes. I mean, it's really striking that when you read yourself into the discussions, the literature on climate change, and then in an entirely separate literature, the literature on the emergence of the new right, they really exist, one as if the other wasn't present. So many of the diagnoses and the prescriptions to deal with climate change presume a finely functioning politics, which of course is the very opposite of what we have. And I'm always struck by the paradox at the very time where we so desperately need a critical alternative way of analyzing the crisis of capitalism and leading us towards an alternative, namely the socialist tradition, it seems virtually lacking, virtually absent from our debates. And the big question, therefore, for which there is no clear answer whatsoever, is what is the alternative? And that's where I go back to the work of Polanyi. So David has already given a flavor of who Polanyi was and of his life trajectory. But what I suppose is significant is that period that he spent in Red Vienna, where he had a very privileged position to closely observe the momentous events of the 1920s and the 1930s. And while we will instinctively look back and think, well, that means the rise of Nazism, etc., it also means the rich experience of living in Red Vienna with its strong labor movement, its socialist municipality, its consumer cooperatives, probably one of the most successful experiments with socialism that we've ever had. And he also took part then in key debates of the time, particularly taking on as a young man the esteemed Professor Ludwig von Mises, who was denying that socialism was possible. Remarkable that Polanyi as a young man had the confidence to enter into debate with him. Von Mises very much influenced Friedrich Hayek, who was a student of his in Vienna at the time. And we have to remember that in those years in Vienna, those debates were leading to what would shape the whole of the 20th century, as David has spoken about: Keynesianism, social democracy, and neoliberalism. And then when he emigrated to England and he began to learn about the British Industrial Revolution and his work with the Workers' Education Association, that led him to finally draw together these series of very rich insights, and those are expressed most richly in The Great Transformation. And the final part of his life then, working on the key insights of the Great Transformation, he worked with a group of economic anthropologists at Columbia University who were examining societies prior to the British Industrial Revolution to show the ways in which the market was embedded in society and served the needs of society rather than vice versa. Very rich work, which was published in 3 co-edited volumes. So I want to start with giving a flavor of what Polanyi offers us by starting, first of all, with a quote. Now, this quote is taken from his writings as a young man, a writing on freedom in 1927. I won't read the whole quote because of lack of time, but as I discovered this quote when I was writing my book, it just struck me as a remarkably insightful understanding of the crisis that we now find ourselves in. That world history presents the eerie image, he says, of desperate children who, enclosed in a cage on a cart, are rolling towards an abyss. We are all grown-up children of this sort, but we have ourselves built the cage that makes us helpless. And then he goes on that humanity doesn't represent a unity. It's not a subject. This is a most fundamental insight, I think. And even if it were a subject, it faces the confusing relation between, on the one hand, the political state and the way in which we organize our economy, often at loggerheads with one another. And it excludes the setting of a universal and a political economic goal from the outset. We can only speak of humanity's freedom when it constitutes itself as a subject, he says. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book. Now, many of us go back to the double movement of Polanyi, as David has already introduced, where the 20th century has shown this pendulum swing from societies dominated by state, in which the market and civil society were very subservient, and then to other societies in the neoliberal era dominated by the market. Neither of these are now adequate. And where we need to go is to a totally new model, what our president calls a eco-social model, where the economy is nested in society, yes, but both are nested in the environment. To ensure that we have a model that doesn't surpass the 9 planetary boundaries that the Stockholm Resilience Institute has discovered, and that we refashion an economy that finds a balance with the ecosystem. And so issues are coming to the fore that really we've forgotten about for the last 100 years. What do we do with our waste, for example? How do we manage a growth economy which is using up the precious resources of the planet? The pollution of air, soil, water, atmosphere, just think of plastics in our ocean, points to the collapse of the system. And it also points to the fact that our knowledge systems themselves have grown up within the parameters of the previous model. The social sciences are largely a legacy of the industrial era, and they themselves need to be radically restructured, particularly, of course, the discipline of economics. And this brings us then to Polanyi's what I call common sense. We've had the common sense of the Keynesian era, the common sense of the Hayekian neoliberal era, and our new era, whatever alternative is going to emerge, needs a new common sense. And I think this comes from Polanyi. It's a critical theory for these unstable times we're living through. And central to his insights, as David has said, is that markets must serve society, be integrated into social values and institutions, and that it was with the British Industrial Revolution, for the first time in human history, that we handed over the running of society to the market mechanism, thereby destroying it. And that's what Polanyi saw as the cause of the wars of the first half of the 20th century and of the emergence of fascism, what he called market society. And as David has said, it does this through treating land, labor, and money as commodities to be bought and sold. Now, I'll come back to these fictitious commodities, but the point I want to emphasize here is that Polanyi is thereby drawing the relationship of society with the natural ecosystem centrally into his social theorizing, which is, I think, what's largely lacking in the way in which we theorize society in the frameworks that we have inherited from the past. And he goes back to emphasize an older understanding of economics that he takes from Aristotle as the provisioning of society, rather than the formal decision-making method based upon a presumption of scarcity and using the price mechanism to find an equilibrium between supply and demand, which is what dominates contemporary economics. And this now we find being echoed in the emerging debates on degrowth, which are, it seems to me are very, very rich, and in donut economics, to take one example. And one great influence on Polanyi was the utopian socialist thinker Robert Owen, associated with the project of New Lanark in Scotland, which I visited a few years ago, very interesting to visit. And this insight is of fundamental importance, because what really Polanyi is arguing is that it's neither the state nor the market that must be the central drivers of our model, but society. Society must come to the fore. And he understood society in the sense of human freedom, of people as the subject of their own future, as the previous quote showed. And we'll come back to that again. So Polanyi, therefore, uniquely, it seems to me, has the potential to move us beyond the options of Keynesianism or Hayekian neoliberalism into the new eco-social paradigm that President Higgins is calling for. Now, it is important to emphasize when we talk about the fictitious commodities that Polanyi wasn't opposed to markets. He didn't see socialism as entailing the eradication of markets. Rather, what he was opposed to was the market mechanism in which all transactions are turned into money transactions and in which private gain becomes the motive of human actions. Those are very fundamental and vital insights. And up to the Industrial Revolution, he argued that markets had never been anything other than accessories of economic life, absorbed in the social system. You know, the sorts of farmers' markets that we know today in many of our localities is an example of markets understood in that Polanyian sense. But extending then this idea of markets to a market mechanism in which land, labor, and money become commodities leads to a complete transformation in the structure of society, wrote Polanyi. And it results in the demolition of society, because it means that nature, which is what he meant by land, human beings, which is what he meant by labor, and the medium of exchange, which is money, are treated as goods to be bought and sold. So they're obviously fictitious. Now, I surprised myself, I think, in writing the book in that the central importance of the decommodification of land, labor, and money, it seems to me, became the core of my book. So there's 3 core chapters, one on each of those forms of commodification and decommodification, and it becomes also the core of the transformative agenda for us today, it seems to me. And how then do we embed the market in society? And this is where Polanyi came up with very, very rich insights from his study of societies prior to the British Industrial Revolution. He identified 3 means of integration: reciprocity, which dominates in communal societies, extended household or family structures, voluntary community groups, or areas like the community I live in, an eco-village, where I've learned a lot about the real rich importance of reciprocity. Redistribution we're more familiar with, because in the heyday of social democracy, of course, we knew societies that very successfully redistributed from the rich to the poor. Of course, now, as Stiglitz reminds us, we now have redistribution from the poor to the rich in the era of neoliberalism. And then the third form of integration is exchange through local markets, in which people bring their produce to either barter or to sell using money. So in that sense, markets are central to Polanyi's understanding, but that is very different from the market mechanism. And each of these are regulated by communal customs, social values, strong social institutions like the guilds in the Middle Ages, trades union, professional groups, and each of them have an institutional context. So the context for reciprocity is the community, what we today call the gift economy. For redistribution, it's the centralized state, as we saw in the era of social democracy. And for exchange, it's localized markets, not the market mechanism. And through these mechanisms, these forms of integration, the market can be integrated again as an institution that serves society. And the threats of the machine age are another set of insights from Polanyi that have become very, very contemporary. He worried greatly about the subordination of man to the needs of the machine. Industrial technology is showing itself wholly capable of generating suicidal tendencies that strike at the roots of liberty and life itself. This was written back in the 1950s, how much truer it is of our society. And of course, it echoes our fears about the threat of automation to jobs, to workers' rights, but also the threat of technology to human freedom, as we're seeing now in this era of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And as David has said, Polanyi drew on Marx in many ways about capitalist society being not only unjust, but unfree, and the way in which workers are alienated from their own beings through the fact that their production is taken from them. But he rejected Marxist historical determination and instead emphasized human freedom. And these 2 quotes, I think, are very rich. That being free is no longer the typical ideology of the bourgeoisie, meaning to be free of duty and responsibility, but to be free means to be free through duty and responsibility, our duty and responsibility to society. And freedom through social knowledge can never mean a specific state of affairs, Rather, it is a program, a goal, which is constantly re-establishing itself. The history of humanity will not have reached its final goal with socialism. Humanity's history will, in its true sense, only begin with it. This is a fundamentally utopian insight, it seems to me. So where in our days are we seeing this emerging? I think we're seeing it in the debates around eco-socialism, based upon the tradition of utopian socialism, workers' control of the workplace, a cooperative economy, communal ownership of land and housing, community-supported agriculture, like our community farm here in Cloughjordan, the gift economy, the localization of production and distribution, forms of democratic and deliberative decision-making. Christian Felber's work on an economy for the common good draws a lot of these together, where he argues that the economy needs to be put under citizens' control. And he designs a demarketized and degrowth economy through citizens' deliberation, which is very mind-blowing, but of course that is the direction we really need to go. Paul Mason, in his work, particularly his book Post-Capitalism, writes that with infotech, large parts of the utopian socialist project become possible, from cooperatives to communes to outbreaks of liberated behavior that redefine human freedom. This model is already emerging, it seems to me. It's emerging in the repurposing of our economy based upon social innovation, sharing and promoting local solutions. This photograph is taken from our own community farm here in Cloughjordan Eco Village. So in the many, many instances of sustainable economy projects, the sharing economy, the social economy, the collaborative economy, the cooperative economy, the information technology, which is subverting market mechanisms through non-commercial forms of production and exchange, and I give examples of some of these in the book, shows that the seeds of this alternative are already being sown. It's already emerging, and we need to understand and identify that. So I just finish off with information. Anybody who wants to contact me has my email there. Anybody who wants to get the book at a reduced price can do so through our own bookshop here in the Eco Village, Sheila Gig, and the information is there. But also to give you the information about the 15th International Karl Polanyi Conference coming up in April, and for the program, a very rich program touching on many of the themes David and myself have just mentioned. You can register there at the Polanyi Institute, and I give the address. Thank you very much.
Father, thank you. That was fantastic. You did a great job there in giving us an outline of the book in a very limited time. So much obliged to you for that. I should mention too that if anybody wants to make an intervention or pose a question, feel free to do so through the chat mechanism. It's a bit restrictive, I understand, and I know, but look, if you can input to that, I will try and take up your points and put them into the discussion which we will have after Mary's contribution. I'll do it as best I can. So Mary, can I invite you then to review the book? Mary is fairly familiar, I think, with the work of Peadar. Both have collaborated before. I'm thinking, Mary, particularly of the book that you and Peadar wrote about the Second Republic. So Mary is also a lecturer in Maynooth University, and she and I know one another too for a good few years. So it's great to have you, Mary. Thank you for participating, and I invite you now to present your review of Peadar's book.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Peadar. Just to say, I mean, I suppose I am familiar with Polanyi's work, and when I first started my PhD 20 years ago this year in DCU under Peadar's supervision, the first thing he said to me as a PhD supervisor was, "Here, read this book," and I'd never heard of Polanyi before then. And I think since then, certainly the book and Polanyi's work has directly and indirectly influenced my own work, work that I've done with Peadar. So the idea of an eco-social paradigm, we first wrote about in that book, Towards a Second Republic, which was actually published 10 years ago in 2011. And indeed, my own next book is called The Future of Welfare is Eco-Social, Making It Happen. So we're very much in the same space of it. So overall, I would have to say I concur with a lot of what's in the book. So I'm going to be a little devil's advocate here and try and draw out some points of contention, if you like, where I think it's worth deepening the discussion a little and throwing around some of the ideas in the book. But doing that in the context of a very welcome overall for the book. It's an incredibly extensive overview of very relevant and topical and timely literature, and a really coherent critique of capitalism. It's invaluable as a resource. I mean, I really would urge people to get it. I will return to it again and again as a teacher, as a researcher and a lecturer, but more important, I think, as an activist, I will return to it again and again, because it's open and honest search for the vital spark, if you like, that can really ignite our imaginations and get us to dream out loud, talk out loud about what the alternative might be and how we might do it is really refreshing. And I think Peadar takes a lot of personal risks in, if you like, in bearing his own heart and mind and soul in relation to putting his stamp on what he believes is the future. And I think that's brave of him to do, and I think it encourages other people to do it. I think likewise in the book, Peadar isn't afraid to talk out loud about the need to interrogate some of the sacred cows of liberalism that we've all known to grow and love. So he talks about maybe the weaknesses of the human rights paradigm in the context of the need to really have tools available to us to be able to take on the present challenges and the sort of stresses that we're seeing in relation to system breakdown. And he asks out loud whether some of the paradigms that we have, like universalism and human rights, are up to the job of tackling discourse that really needs to be more located in issues that are very local in the context of globalization. So it's challenging stuff, and I really welcome that. It's organized into 4 clear parts. The first is a critique of capitalism, which Peadar very much addressed there, and that addresses the system breakdown and the loss of hope that comes with that. But then it very hopefully and positively engages in part 2 and maps an alternative eco-social future. It then looks at that concept of commodification across the fictitious commodities of land, labour and capital, and very usefully updates those in the context of ecological, social and financial commodification that we're seeing at the moment. And the last part, Whither and How, argues for a new public philosophy. And I think this is really important, the new public philosophy to take us beyond market society. So there's a number of recurring themes in the book, and I want to just address a few of them, hopefully in a kind of chronological way, but maybe not, just as a way of adding some value to our discussion here today. So I want to address the concept of paradigm change that's really informing the agenda of the book, the idea of the social totality of relations that's behind that idea of the human, the concepts of commodification and reciprocity that Peadar introduced there, and the notion of alternatives and the challenges of mobilizations. And just starting with the idea of paradigm change, I think this is really important because the book is a call to open up our cognitive locks, as Mark Bly would have had it, and to open up to the idea of a reset, of going at this completely differently. And there's an argument that COVID and the pandemic gives us an opportunity for that reset, and also gives us some bit of a glimpse of some of the policy alternatives that might open up in the context of paradigm change. And not to pour cold water over that agenda, but I do think that expectations of paradigm change, they often overestimate the degree to which crises like this one will result in change. And I guess our experience of the last great financial crisis bears that out, that the empirical reality is often that these crises actually reinforce neoliberalism. So we should not be rose-tinted about the likelihood of the pandemic rebaselining the future. But it's all the more important, therefore, I think, that we have alternatives and we have ideas so that critical junctures can indeed be opportunities to bring about paradigm change. And I think the book is really valuable in that regard. But I think how we frame those alternative paradigms is really important. And this is a debate that I've had with Peadar on and off about the nature of language when we're trying to frame alternatives. And I think there is a bit of a tension in the book. And even as Peadar spoke there, I was trying to work out whether we're talking about an eco-social paradigm or an eco-socialism. And I think there probably is a difference, not so much in the concepts themselves as they're understood in the book and by Peadar, but by how the framing of them is understood by a general public who may or not be attracted to the type of ideologies that are being unpacked. And I have argued with Peadar that although the richness of the word socialism can be traced back to the centering of an ideology that puts society at the heart and that deregulates, if you like, the work of the state and the work of the market and makes it subservient to society, it's not necessarily how that word is understood and used in ordinary vernacular. And I think the framing of the idea of an eco-social future or an eco-social paradigm, it really needs to be important how we use the language so that it is attractive to people and that they see themselves in it. I'm very minded by Emma Goldman's quote that apparently she never actually said, but if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution. And if I can't see myself in the language of the alternative, I'm not going there with you. And I think that's really important in hanging on to as a basic idea of how do we frame our paradigms and our alternatives. And I think we might take that up when Jack is coming back in, and because there's generational and different national contexts to how some of this language bears out. I think in relation to the concept of commodification, the book is really important in giving us a language and giving us concepts to critique our understanding of what neoliberalism is doing to us right now, the degree to which the market is overly dominant in how we're experiencing our livelihoods and our well-being. And I mean, COVID showed us that so well. 80% of our nursing homes, 70% of our childcare infrastructure provided through the market, and the devastating impacts that had for our ability really to cope with the policy responses that we needed to really mitigate the impact of COVID. So we remain limited even now by our poor capacity in housing, health, nursing homes, creches, education, special needs provision, you name it. Like the fault lines, the underlying conditions of our market society are really exposed and have made us much more vulnerable than we needed to be in the context of COVID. So those calls for a decommodified political economy, a definancialization of our worlds, is very real. And I think I see a lot of people using that language. I was involved a while ago in a very refreshing and hopeful look at the number of privatized services that were being re-municipalized across the world, from very small things like nursing homes or graveyards to very big things like electricity grids. Over 2,000 examples around the world where local authorities were re-municipalizing, taking back into public and social control things that had been previously privatized into the market. So that idea of decommodification and definancialization is very real, it's very tangible, and it's very doable. And I think that the book is very much pointing in that direction. Having said that, I do think it's important to think hard about the idea of decommodification and commodification, because to some degree, and this is particularly true maybe in feminist literature, sometimes the market and getting a job or getting an independent income through the market can be very, very fundamental for people who are trying to escape some social unfreedoms. And for example, the trap of the family for many women as they have experienced it, and even experience it now in COVID in the context of domestic violence. So I think sometimes this concept of commodification is slightly more complicated than it may appear to be in a simple rendering of it. I'm not saying Peadar's is simple, but I'm saying we need to treat where people need commodification and where they need decommodification. There's also, coming from the unemployed movement, as I have done in my own life, there's the reality that if you can't get a job, that you really do call for the right to work and the right in some respects to be commodified. So this is much more complex, I think, from a gendered and a class perspective. And I think unpacking it a little bit more is useful. And I think my probably sole real critique of the book to some degree is the degree to which in the discussion of commodification and maybe in the identification of alternatives, that more could be done to centralize gender and care within the vision of the alternative. I think there's a lot that can be gained from bringing gender out very explicitly as a variable of analysis, both in defining the problem, also in defining the future, but also in defining the politics of how to get there, because it's those connections across social reproduction and production and putting care of people and care of the ecology together that really allow us connect the dots and make for those social movements that we need to create a politics of the future. So I think that's important in that respect. So looking at that in the context of humanity as a subject, because I think what Polanyi was doing and what Peadar's doing in the book is talking about the social totality of relationships and drawing out our interdependence and trying to make us realize how truly interdependent and reciprocal our lives are in relation to the really meaningful way that we live and depend on each other in this world. And again, I think that's where, you know, I think feminist ethics of care literature offer an incredible amount here. And I just want to offer one definition from Fisher and Toronto in 1990. They define care as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. I think those ethics of care offer an immense amount to the challenge of an eco-social understanding of what would be in. And I think that's really, really useful to bring in a little bit more, bring in our human care relations and our ecological relationship with nature and understand them as the one thing. And I think that's what the ethic of care can do. So, I mean, the pandemic does make us very aware of that kind of interdependency. And I think we could strengthen our understanding of an eco-social paradigm by putting care more fully at the centre of it. I think the other thing that Peadar draws our attention to, and I love this about Polanyi myself, is those anthropological concepts of how humans outside of capitalist systems of production, how they maintained their own livelihoods and lives. And these ideas of redistribution, reciprocity and exchange being central to all societies and how they organise our lives. And as Peadar says, the idea that exchange mechanisms, including barter markets and money-based markets, can be part of any particular future. But it's the idea of reciprocity that really gets me. And I think Peadar quoted it already, but I think it needs to be quoted a lot because it's actually quite deep as an idea and hard to get our understanding. But we are at our best not when we are free of responsibility to each other, but through our duties and responsibilities to each other. Now, I think in the wrong hands, that sentence could be used to promote all kinds of quite dodgy policies, to be quite frank. And I think we've seen it in the big society in the UK, and David Cameron probably used words quite similar to that. However, I think at the heart of it is that idea of reciprocity and interdependency and an ethic of care. And I think really trying to re-understand how our welfare regime or what we understand the welfare state at the moment, how that can be reimagined to enable us to care for each other and to have reciprocal relations with each other is a really core challenge. So how could our universal services, how could our income support systems, our cash transfers, our tax systems, how can they help us to be more interdependent with each other and to enable our reciprocal lives work out together? We've seen a lot of that during COVID, how we are reciprocal with each other and how we do care for each other. But how can the state mechanisms enable that and support it more? And I think that's a space that we can unpack a little bit more when we talk about an eco-social paradigm. And I think as Peadar offers, there is a lot in the utopian socialism and the call to restore the fullness of society, the kind of institutions, cultures, and the values that need to underpin that reciprocal world that we want to live in. And I think he maps that really clearly in the section on the alternative when he talks about a new public philosophy. And I mean, there's a real balance to be got there, isn't there, between, it's quite challenging to, there's a lot of people on this call who are probably in the social democratic vein or kind of old Fabians, if you like. And the idea of being challenged about what is the space for the state, what is the space for the market, and what's the prime space for society, that causes a lot of people who spend their lives campaigning for public services and spend their lives campaigning against the privatization of public services. That's quite challenging for us to kind of think again and say, okay, what if the state isn't at the epicenter of everything? What if society gets the more dominant framing in this eco-social paradigm? What does that mean for a lot of what we've been working for and what we call on? So I think it's quite difficult to get the balance right. across those things. And I mean, one of my favorite logos is that the future is public. And I often say the future is local. The future is local, the future is public, the future needs to be social too. So how do we get the framing of that right so that public and social or society remains in the frame in an eco-social paradigm? The alternative for Kirby, it's quite unambivalent in some respects, I think. And he does use the word socialism to refer to self-organizing democratic institutions where society itself creates markets and democracies. So the social in this context very much hinges around democratic institutions. And we know how fragile they are. We were talking about it before this started up, but we know as well that some of the rich experimentations that have been having around participatory and deliberative and other forms of democracy can be helpful here in trying to reimagine how society can take control of creating markets and states, valuing individual freedom, but also the centre of society. And that understanding that humans' real relationships and capacity only exists in the context of society, in our social context, our relationships with each other. So this is radical thinking, I think. It's not tweaking, it's not incremental policy change. It requires a fairly significant start again in terms of where we understand the possibilities. But as Peadar says, there are ideas, there are examples, and there are policy debates that are ongoing in decommodification, definancialization. The Green New Deal offers us examples, the degrowth movement, the limits to growth. And Peadar sums them up himself as degrowth, limits, community, and globalization. I would add to that care. I think care needs to be much more explicit in the middle of this eco-social paradigm if it's to make me dance and want to be part of the revolution. And I want to finish on dancing, on mobilization, and the idea that we need to make some of this fun. We need to make people want to be engaged in these debates and to take part in them. And we've a lot to learn from some of what our younger generations are doing in relation to reimagining mobilization, new social movements and the like, and bringing in new methods of campaigning and mobilization. And the hope for Kirby is that new politics emerges in the gaps and can be progressed across common threads, where society picks up on each other's issues and connects them together in real life, in their everyday worlds. And I think that is important, and that is indeed how it does happen. And I think Jack Schenker is going to talk later, but I suppose his examination of that capacity for new politics emerging, despite the stresses and the system breakdowns of capitalism, but the degree to which those system breakdowns enable people to see and join the dots between groups where they may not otherwise make those connections, that's really important. But Naomi Klein talks about the need to let that happen and encourage that to happen, but that there's also rich learning from old social movements that did achieve fairly significant social transformations, and that younger social movements may need to learn from in terms of some of the strategies for change that they engage in. So to my mind, it's that relationship between the old and the new that's really important, and how we connect those separate universes. I spoke at Peter Beresford's work the other day on participation and ideology, and he laid down a really important challenge, and it's the danger of elite creation of ideologies, including maybe a eco-social ideology or paradigm, and the degree to which people aren't able to participate in the creation of the ideologies that we're asking them to follow and adopt as their alternatives. So how do we enable people? We need ideologies to inspire people at one level, but we also need to leave the space within the ideological building to let people name and be part of the process of building up these alternatives and creating their own ideologies. And that's not easy to do, but I think it's a really important challenge, as is the need to engage with potential adversaries to those ideologies. And I think the water movement space in Irish politics offers rich learning for me there, because it showed where something divided people who on another agenda could have been potential allies with each other. So how do we let that happen? How do we let divides happen when indeed we could find more uniting kind of ways of approaching common challenges? So my hope is the book will open and oil the key to those cognitive locks, to let our minds imagine the alternatives and to allow ourselves to be part of creating a new political narrative. Ultimately, the book calls for a new story, a new public philosophy, where the future would be public, social and local. And I think that's a really good starting point in enabling us to see where we fit into that story, what part we can all play, because without us all playing a part, there won't be a new story. I'd be fairly sure of that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Brilliant, Mary. Thank you so much for that. I mean, there was such a richness of ideas in your review, and you seem to have pulled out extraordinarily interesting points from Peadar's book. While you were speaking, just something occurred to me. You know, last month there, Joe Biden made a speech in, well, virtually, of course, but it was the Munich Security Conference. And his message really was, you know, America is back. But coincident with that, and this takes up some of the thoughts that you put out there about the relationship between states and markets and local, and indeed climate. At the very same time, there was an extraordinary crisis in Texas because they had this very acute snowstorm. And the local networks, the power networks, were not sufficient to meet the needs of the people. And the reason that they couldn't meet the demand was because of deregulation and privatization and disconnection from any other local state, if you like, where they might have had some assistance. And the thing was, you know, where Texas had set itself up as this sort of lone star, as it were, lower taxation, lower everything. But the consequence of it was horrendous. I mean, 20 people lost their lives as a result of it. But it was an extraordinary thing that Biden was, you know, saying on the world stage, America's back. But this actual complete disintegration of interdependence and the relationship between states and markets and society was happening just at the same time. So I thought that was quite interesting. The other thing I would just say, you know, you mentioned Mark Blythe there and the need to, I think what you said was open the cognitive box. And this is very, very interesting, I think, and maybe Peadar will come in on this as well, that you know, when you talk about anthropology and the concepts of interdependence and gender and reciprocity and care, it really raises this fundamental anthropological question of what does it mean to be human in the world that we live in today? So maybe, Peadar, would you care to comment on that at all?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Mary, especially. That was very rich, and I really appreciate your engaging with my work in such a thoughtful way. David, you raised a very fundamental issue, and it seems to me it's one that we have lost sight of very much. I mean, we do talk about the Homo economicus, and of course, so much of the insights of psychology, psychotherapy, of sociology indeed contradict completely the very reductionist way in which Homo economicus is constructed as a you know, constructing the human person as making decisions on the basis of cost benefit analysis of what's going to serve their interests. That completely contradicts so much of our human experience. Yet the important thing to say is that really has such a hold on the public imagination and on policy making, because it has a hold on the discipline of economics. I mean, most economists will say it's not the full picture, and yet we construct our public economics around this understanding of what we are as human beings, and therefore we become grasping and focused upon things like consumption, etc. No surprise. So, yeah, I agree with you that we do need to get back to, again, examine the fact, and Mary put a lot of emphasis on it, and I fully agree with it. And the COVID has been a wake-up call. We depend on one another. We are interdependent beings. We're not self-sufficient beings. And when systems break down, the systems that allowed us to live with the illusion that we're self-sufficient beings, even though much of our self-sufficiency comes from investments, public investments in education and in healthcare, that we just take for granted. But when those begin to break down, then suddenly we realize that we need our neighbors, we need our family, we need the people around us, we need the kindness of strangers, to use that phrase that's often used. And how do we then reimagine an economics in particular that will build upon that and will facilitate that and will strengthen those what are often very, very, very fragile social networks? That's what we need. And I think that's where we're beginning to emerge. That's why I love the degrowth stuff, because I think it frees our imagination to think about economics in a totally different way. Even reading Christian Felber's book about the economy for the common good, I mean, the audacity of saying, why can't we as citizens construct our own economy, create the markets that we need? Why can't we decide by public vote if necessary what should be the gap between a maximum income and a minimum income? Of course, why shouldn't we? And those are examples of putting society back in the driver's seat. So yeah, thank you, David. I mean, that's a good way of opening this discussion.
Okay, thanks, Paula. And I wonder, I mean, are you in any way encouraged, or do you think it's a diversion, the fact that we have had largely a Keynesian response to the COVID crisis? And Mary, you might come in on this as well, like that in the United States, you know, with the 1.9 trillion package that Joe Biden has brought in, and the 750 billion package in Europe, and the fact that there has been quite a lot of social support for people affected by the crisis. Do you see any hope in that, or do you think that it's sort of missing the point in some way?
No, I don't think it's missing the point at all. It's absolutely essential, and I think things would have been worse without it. But however, it is a real wake-up call for all of us to realize that what has Barack Obama succeeded by, you know, and we don't have to go into what he's been succeeded by. So what is it about these massive public spending projects that really seem, certainly taking the example of the United States, and of course we have equivalent examples from Britain associated with Brexit, that far from drawing the people who have suffered from the collapse back into the discussion in ways that help them to see that these are pathways forward that will benefit them, it seems to further alienate them. In other words, what's at the heart of these conspiracy theories but the belief that there's an elite that's manipulating everything in their own interests? So this is a wake-up call to the fact that we really need, I think, to be much more focused upon the sort of collaborative endeavors that allow people to take charge again of their own immediate local life, economic and social, which often these big schemes from the state can bypass. They're not necessarily oiling the wheels of local creativity and local endeavors. They're putting money into big investment projects. So yeah, that'll be my sense. Mary, I'm sure would have something to say about that.
Yeah. Well, Mary, have you something to say about it?
I always have something to say about everything.
And there's a surprise now, yeah.
I mean, I suppose, what's absent is the investment in any kind of structural change. You know, that these are temporary investments, they're emergency investments, and that we see that very clearly. We see, you know, health is a really good example. We see the emergency investment in what looked like a universal health care system, and then the immediate retraction of it. We see people really trying to push hard now for the investment in a universal care approach. So whether or not we can get any of these temporary investments over the line to some degree to become more permanent restructuring of policy towards the type of thing that we're talking about, I think what might be more interesting is less the Keynesianism that we see and more the societal interventions that we see, that it must cause communities to rethink how powerful they are and how much they can do things and how much they can control local agendas in particular by seeing what they did. And that, you know, there must be some encouragement in that if we can keep some of that momentum there in terms of society's feeling that they can, you know, that they can do this, that might be quite as important as what the state is doing.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, indeed. I just read out a couple of the messages which have come up on chat, and there are some questions inherent in them. The first one is for Hugh Brennan. Hugh says, great passion, Peadar, for your topic. Thank you very much. I'm very taken with the work of Kate Raworth, with whom you have a lot in common. I look forward to reading your book. And that's from Hugh. And then there's another one from, I hope I don't pronounce this wrong, but Alone Downey says, first of all, thank you, Peadar, for that inspiring insight into your book. Second, a question for either David or Peadar. To what extent do you think this emerging alternative will be suppressed or halted by the dominant MNCs in the Irish economy? And how do you think this can be overcome? So, Peadar, do you want to say anything about Kate Raworth there, that first comment from Hugh?
Yeah, hello, Hugh. Thank you for your comment. Yeah, I mean, Kate Raworth's book is to me of seminal importance. I really think it reimagines the economy in a totally new way, and in a way that is consistent with the need to nest again the economy within society, within the environment. It's the best and richest work that's being done around that. So yes, I agree with you. She's a woman I'd love to meet and engage with. She's giving a lecture in UCC soon, which I hope to be able to attend. But the other question,
but the MNCs in the Irish economy, yeah, the other question,
I think that this is a very, very fun.
Yeah.
Over to you, David.
Yeah, no, sorry, the question was, to what extent do you think in terms of the MNCs, the emerging alternative will be suppressed or halted by the dominant MNCs in the Irish economy? And how do you think this will be overcome? That was the question. I mean, I think myself that, like, obviously, as everybody knows, the Irish economy is hugely dependent on foreign direct investment, and it has been the sort of key pillar of industrial policy for 50 years now to attract foreign direct investment into the country. And in many ways, it has been extremely beneficial to Ireland and has given very good employment. And I suppose, from an ecological point of view, you could say that it has allowed us to transcend, if you like, the smokestack industry period. A lot of these industries are very clean. But I think that to the general question, I think that we in this country alone are not going to be able to solve it, as it were. I think it is one of these things that fall into the category of the commons, the international common good, and that we need sort of changes in attitudes more widely and internationally about that. And some stuff has been fairly good in recent times. Some of the stuff that's been coming from the American Business Roundtable about stakeholders and different kind of model has been sounded fairly progressive, if it can be believed. Now, a lot of people of my background might say that it's something like a change before death, but nevertheless, there might be a pragmatic realization that we can't go on with the world as it is at the moment. More domestically, Danny McCoy, head of IBEC, a man for whom I have a considerable respect, has made some very interesting comments in recent weeks about our own society and how we have to take on board that realization that there's more at stake than simply making profits. And I think that he's quite a good thinker, if you like, on the industrial side. So it depends hugely, I think myself, on to what extent we can internationalize this whole message. And that would be, Polanyi's view, basically, as well, I guess. So that's my take on that particular question. Mary, do you want to say anything more about it at the moment?
There's lots more questions there, so if you want to.
Sorry, yeah. Okay. The next then I might take up is, I don't actually have a name, I'm sorry, but I'll read it out anyway. It says, many thanks for this talk. The crisis in capitalism, a crisis of care, as Nancy Fraser, Sylvia Federici, and others have long pointed out, and as COVID now highlights, a total refiguring of gender relations and how care is organised is required. How does Karl Polanyi engage with these key aspects. That seems to resonate very much with what you were saying there towards the end of your review, Mary.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll let Peadar take the question because I think it's more.
Okay, off you go, Peadar.
Polanyi's total work.
Yeah. Right.
I totally agree with Mary, and I mean, if we take seriously Polanyi's concept of reciprocity, then it points absolutely forcefully to the central importance of care, both the economy of care and the society of care. I mean, it brings us back into the heart of community. And at the very, of course, the very heart ultimately of what Polanyi is talking about is that we need to live in a rich community. And what doesn't allow us to do that is the social system that we're embedded in a market society, which contradicts the logic of real community. So, I mean, care in all its forms, and we've learned that through COVID, is of course central to drawing a real reciprocity. And by reciprocity, I mean the term itself may not mean a lot to people, but if we think of interdependence, of the many, many ways in which we depend on each other, not in the sort of calculating way that I'll do something for you if I'm sure that I'll get back the equivalent from you. I mean, that's the sort of market mentality. And reciprocity is that I'll do something for you and you may never give me back anything, but I know that when I need something, there's many other people around who'll give it to me. That's the nature of a real interdependent society. And we need to find ways in which we institutionalize that, as Mary was saying, in much, much fuller and richer ways. And like one of the things just to bring in that I didn't mention in my talk, but it came very forcefully home to me when I was writing my book, Polanyi really has nothing to say about the state. He presupposes a role for the state, but he doesn't theorize it. He doesn't really draw it into the discussion, certainly not in The Great Transformation. There is some of his earlier work during his Vienna time that's now appearing in English for the first time, where there is somewhat of a discussion on the role of the state, but he presupposes a state that's more equivalent, I think, to what is emerging today around concepts like the enabling state. And I think we need an awful lot more work, and Mary's comments very much play into that, of how such a state may operate. It's not the Keynesian state, it's not the command state. You know, I've learned in my years, and Mary sort of adverted to it, that social democracy, the mindset of social democracy, is very statist ultimately. And I think that's again one of the challenges of Polanyi, to move beyond that, but not to move beyond it in the way, and Mary quite rightly emphasized it, into these notions that we sort of retreat from the state and we lay all the burden on society, the big society of David Cameron, as she mentioned. No, that's not what Polanyi is talking about at all, even though he doesn't theorize the state. He presupposes a state that ultimately is the guarantor to ensure that the market mechanism doesn't take over. So all of this is very rich. Now, this isn't by way of an answer, I suppose, to the question. It's more drawing some themes out. So that would be my top and statement.
Well, actually, that's great, Peadar, because that fits in very well with a question that's just come in from Chris Little. Chris says the following: can this transformation of the market society come about without a socialist revolution? Does Polanyi understand socialism as in social democracy or revolutionary socialism? How would the politics informed by Peadar's ideas navigate around the liberal capitalist state? What do you think of that?
Polanyi understands socialism neither in a social democratic way. I think there is a social democratic reading of Polanyi, but I think it's fundamentally misunderstands the transformative thrust of Polanyi's work. And neither is he a theorist who sees socialism as emerging through the takeover of state power, which we understood during much of the 20th century. He sees socialism as a cooperative, localized form of collaboration between producers and consumers to realize a better society. I mean, he has a book entitled The Livelihood of Man, and if we sort of de-gender that title, the livelihood of people, the livelihood of society. At the heart of his form of socialism is a form in which society takes charge of its own provisioning in the richest sense of the word, both economically and socially and culturally, etc. So the politics of that then, which Chris's point raises, are very interesting. And again, it gets us back to some of the stuff, and I have quoted Christian Felber, about how do we construct a form of local deliberative democracy where more and more of the decision-making around the economy, not just around politics or around society, is put into the hands of citizens in a deliberative way. And like, you know, we're a million miles from there. Our democracy has, with an awful lot of struggles over about a 150-year period, has come to take over the political system, but not the economic system in the slightest way. In many ways, we've retreated from that in recent decades, the recent decades of neoliberalism. So the politics of that are very much localized politics, in my view. And that's why I ended with a slide about the alternative is emerging. That's the socialist revolution that is happening, in my view. The word revolution isn't in vogue so much as the word transformation, but I am more and more convinced that if we link up the dots, that in every locale, in every country in the world, there are projects that are emerging, and Jack Schenker has done a wonderful work in richly documenting some of these, their struggles against the way in which the state or the market is taking over or neglecting communities, but it's communities coming together in the most adverse of circumstances, in some cases, others rather more benign circumstances, and they themselves, through their own power, are challenging and are creating. Maybe Jack would like to come in on this. That's the politics of this new model, in my view.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe, Jack, rather than spoil your reflections at the end, I might ask you just to hold on. I'll give you plenty of time at the end. But in the meantime, there's another specific question for Mary as follows. As you have outlined, Mary, the necessity to frame this new alternative as attractive, accessible and possible is crucial. How do you think this is best conveyed to the general public when political elites, multinational corporations and lobby groups are likely to keep such discussions off the agenda and taint it with misinformation?
Thanks, Olin. The next question down is just about the role of citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracies.
That's right, yeah.
And I think taking...
Want me to take that first, Mary? And take
I can pull in both, I think, because
Well, maybe I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll just read this next question, and you can encompass both in your reply. So the next person is Claire O'Connor, and Claire says, I was on the Citizens' Assembly on Climate, and their recommendations were considered to be quite radical at the time. But the recommendations made were a direct response to the way climate change was presented to us. That is a technological economic problem, and we responded with policy solutions in the same vein, all to fit within a neoliberal model. How would we go about bringing eco-socialism, degrowth into these types of deliberations and political arena more generally? So Mary, if you can cover those two, Gran, and then I might come back to Peadar and ask him to respond to that.
Can I start just by commenting just on Peadar's last answer, because I think in response to Chris Little's question, because I actually think it's quite important, because Peadar, he described a socialist revolution, and just going back to my earlier comments about the importance of language, and immediately like what some people listening in will think of as a socialist revolution will be very different to what I would call an eco-social transformation. And I actually think, not to labour the point, but I actually think it's absolutely crucial what language we are using to describe what we mean, because the language will enable the mobilisations to happen. And if people don't see themselves in the language, or don't understand the language, or if they attribute wrong meaning to the language, then some things stop before they even start. And to some degree, that's the beginning of the answer to Olin, is that I think this conversation, to both Claire and Olin, is this conversation has to happen at a societal level to begin with. It's not going to happen in market controlled spaces. including a lot of our media, which is market owned, and it's not going to happen in very state-centric spaces, including state-shaped deliberative assemblies, because as Claire says, they are going to set the agenda so narrowly that you're not going to be able to control imaginative paradigm making alternative discussions in them. So by definition, these things have to happen on the ground, bubbling up and up and up until they get some level of critical mass. And then they become meaningful enough to engage in state and market spaces. But right now, I wouldn't expect to be able to get much traction for them in mainstream media or in state designed spaces for deliberation. By definition, that's not where change happens. But the other thing is, I suppose, that the book, Peadar draws on Eric Olwyn Wright's Strategies for Transformation, and he points out sometimes change is ruptural, sometimes change is interstitial, it's happening by design and by prefabrication and experimentation as we develop our lives, and sometimes it is relatively symbiotic or more incremental or kind of social democratic type reformist change. And all those changes are valid. But what's really important, I think, for movement building is that we don't get in each other's way in this agenda. So we don't start fighting that my definition of change is the only way it could happen, or mine is the only way it could happen. We have to expect that different strategies for change coexist. And I think the real agenda is not to split in the sense of it, but how do we let those dots get connected in constructive ways where we're all working towards common ends, even if we're doing it in different ways and using different models of change to get there. I think it's keeping an eye on the common end. And that's why the paradigm, the idea of an imaginative alternative that we can all put our faith in and work towards in our different ways is very important.
Okay. Can I ask you something that's bothering me now personally about all of this? And it's on the interdependence question in a way. And climate risk and biodiversity and so on, I mean, very clearly a huge issue for the whole of humankind at the moment. But yet we live in a world where geopolitical tensions are rising all the time, where China is now emerging as an alternative pole of influence and power to the United States, and where I suppose in the future it's possible that other countries are going to be pressed into places where they may have to align with one or the other in a new kind of great power dispensation. How do you think we're going to actually get a sense of common purpose to deal with these questions in such circumstances? I know that's kind of an impossible question, but I'm just conscious of the fact, like listening this morning to about the meeting in Alaska between the American and Chinese representatives, and the tone of that was so hostile. You just would be very worried about it. Any thoughts?
Who are you asking, David? Are you asking me or me?
I ask anybody who will volunteer to make a point, either yourself or Mary, I've just simply said that I suppose it's good to talk in our context of our own country and local and so on, but we have this is the problem with climate risk and biodiversity, that you actually have to have a global response to it.
Oh, I totally agree. And when you look at global politics, of course, we're less cooperative than we were, certainly in the first decades of the post-war era. Well, then we were locked into different camps, if you like. But however, I mean, everything you said, I totally take. And I do think that the emergence of China is a real worry about, it's now beginning to flex its muscles. And it just shows that it's willing to ride roughshod over societies and over whole communities. What's happening to the Uyghurs is almost, has certain equivalences to what the Nazis did. But on the other hand, global society is being pulled, screaming and shouting into the fact that it has to collaborate to get climate change under control. And there's big focus now on what's going to happen in Glasgow in November, and a lot of preliminary work going on. So, that's pushing things in somewhat of a different way. And like, this is one where we have no options left. The climate change issue is not one where if we fail, well, life goes on maybe in a somewhat reduced way. This is the future of humanity on the planet. And I mean, as Mary has said, I agree with her that there's some really interesting, I think, pushback bubbling up. And it was bubbling up more stronger before COVID. I mean, so Extinction Rebellion, the children's school strikes, but as much as the actual manifestations out on the streets, it's the new consciousness that is emerging through that. I mean, to find Greta Thunberg going to the UN General Assembly and telling the assembled leaders of the world to, what did she say? They're locked up in their illusions of constant growth and while the planet is burning or something. You know, that's a sort of a level of consciousness, and that somebody is articulating it at the heart of the global political system is remarkable in its own right. So we have these two forces that are pointing in totally different directions, but one of which has the ultimate certainty behind it that if we don't solve the climate crisis in some way, and of course solve is the wrong word, if we don't grapple with it and address it in some effective way, then, you know, there is no future for humanity on this planet effectively. And that penny is beginning to drop. Now, whether that knocks shape on global politics in a new way, I mean, it would be very foolhardy for me to say that, but that's the other pressure that's there that I think we have to take into account. Can I just say I was very taken with Claire's question, and it is a very, very important question. All I would say is, I think, again, you know, the scales fall from our eyes. If we think that a highly neoliberalized state like the Irish one, very dependent upon foreign direct investment, is going to rock the model in any way, then, you know, we're not in the real world. And so while I think the Citizens' Assembly has done very good work on many issues, including climate change, where I think it has made a bit of a breakthrough, where we really need to go with all this, and of course some of the people who've left the Green Party because they're not satisfied with it being radical enough have highlighted this, is that there is a much richer and more radical agenda being developed. It's not just in people's books or in people's minds. It's being worked out on the ground in all sorts of concrete local projects, often going against the tide and going against you know, facing the opposition of local authority figures, etc. And that's where I recommend to Claire, you know, as well as doing good work in the Citizens' Assembly, make sure that we all need to be part of these, to be linked into them, to realize the rich debates, the immense social creativity that's going on. And that is all moving in a particular direction towards a degrowth, a decommodified future. I don't want to romanticize it, but I think often we underestimate its importance because we still have our minds, certainly for people of my generation, very much full of the thinking of the 20th century, which doesn't allow us to open our eyes to see the forms of transformation. And Mary, I fully agree with her, is right. It's the very language we use is important to really capture what really is going on.
Mary, do you want to say anything more? I'm going to invite Jack to come in to give his reflections in a minute. Before I do, is there anything that you'd like to say before we do that?
No, I thought your question about the global geopolitics was sobering, and going back to insist on hope as a political position. But I think COVID does offer us some positive and negative lessons there. I mean, we see global collaboration producing the vaccine so quickly, but then we see the people's vaccine movement about the unequal distribution of the vaccine. But we also see the concept of interdependency, the penny dropping quite significantly, I think, in that debate, where, rich countries are realizing that if they don't enable poor countries to access vaccines, that this COVID will be with us a lot longer. So I think there's good and bad in all that, but I think there's interest in learning about some of that geopolitics. And I think Peadar's right, the scale of some of the challenges that will come in relation to climate change, what somebody described it as the pandemic on steroids. But, we're only in the halfpenny place when we look at some of the challenges that we will have to grapple as state, market and society. So that should force some interdependence.
Thank you, Mary. That's great. I hate to do this to you, Peadar, but you and I are probably of a vintage that might remember Barry Maguire had a great song in the 1960s. It's called The Eve of Destruction. And I remember he had a line in it, you know, think of all the hate there is in Red China and blah, blah. I can't remember the rest of it. But the extraordinary thing is, you know, for different reasons on the geopolitical front, we've been here before. The good news is Barry is still alive, by the way, going strong at 84. Just thought I'd add that in. Anyway, Jack, thank you for waiting so patiently to give your reflections. Delighted to have you back again in TASC after your TASC lecture some couple of years ago. And as I think I said at the outset, you're both an author and a journalist. So we're very privileged to have you today. So I invite you now maybe to give your reflections on the book and on the short discussion that we've had.
Thank you, David, and hello everyone from sunny London. I'm really grateful to have been invited along today. So thank you to Peadar and to everyone at TASC, and of course to everyone involved in the discussion. It's been so invigorating and really a balm to the soul. I think the past year has been tough on a great many of us, emotionally, socially, politically. At times, not only have we been grappling with a torrential stream of bad news, but we've also felt stripped of agency. And books like Peadar's and debates like the one we've just had are a shot in the arm, if you'll forgive the somewhat topical pun, a reminder that our world is there to be remade. And, you know, over the past hour and a half, there's been such a rich reservoir of ideas. All I can do in the few minutes I've got is skim the surface and pick out a couple of threads. I mean, I think the first one to hone in on is the timing and you know, the context in which we're having this debate. The book, as far as I understand it, was certainly conceived of and largely written before any of us knew or had heard of the term coronavirus. And what's happened since has brought to the fore both the deep and dangerous insecurities engendered by market societies, but also the potential for paradigm shifts. If we ever needed more evidence that the old Thatcherite mantra of there is no alternative was at least on its knees, so, albeit not dead yet, unfortunately, and events over the past decade or so since the 2008 financial crisis have certainly supplied plenty of examples of that, then this extraordinary past year has provided it. Polanyi predicted both the catastrophic consequences of a market society on its citizens and also the way in which it would devastate our relationship with nature. And certainly it feels to me that the COVID pandemic has brought that to light. You know, it's unleashed a new social catastrophe that's nested inside a great many existing social catastrophes, like a Russian doll. And the transmission lines of the disease have often proved to be the very cracks that Polanyi and indeed Peadar identify as features of a market society, one in which the market mechanism has that dominance: poverty, precariousness, financial and mental insecurities. And interestingly, our mutual responses to it, certainly at a grassroots level, have at times offered a window onto the new social paradigm that Peadar rightly argues is not only possible, but necessary. I was struck too, though, by the points that Mary was bringing into the conversation about the dangers of having too much of a rose-tinted view on this, and that applies to the context of the pandemic as well. Certainly in Britain, but I think globally too. You know, we've seen tensions between, on one level, the normalization of big state interventions and huge public spending, but also a real entrenchment of market mechanisms. You know, be that the global ways in which vaccines are researched and produced by big pharma. Public procurement in the UK, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has been seeped in corruption and privatized financial interests. And I think it speaks too to the point that Mary brought out about putting questions of care at the heart of our conversation today, because that's been another source of contradictions here. We have been told to, and many of us have very eagerly gone out and clapped every Thursday at 8 o'clock, our frontline workers, particularly care workers. There's been a great valorization of those engaged in the business of care. And yet at the same time, there has been an ongoing reproduction of that economic reality that it is seen as a business and it's framed as a business. And, you know, the UK's care workers are by and large on 0 hours contracts, often, you know, close to the minimum wage. And those insecurities have helped hinder the country's response to the pandemic, and they've also contributed to its spread. You know, the fact that in the UK, vast numbers of people, including most care workers, don't get any occupational sick pay. Thus, when they themselves contracted COVID, couldn't risk staying at home because they needed to earn money to pay their rent and so on, has been a major source of the spread of the pandemic in the UK, and one of the reasons why the statistics here, case numbers and deaths, have been as bad as they have. You know, Mary talked about the importance of the language of alternatives, and I think that's a critical debate. And we've talked today as well about the tensions when it comes to moving beyond the neoliberal paradigm between centering the state in a traditional social democratic fashion and thinking more imaginatively about building a new type of politics that is rooted in society. And I think, if you'll forgive just a brief digression, you know, that tension was at the heart of the Corbyn Labour project in the UK, and was one of the major reasons why electorally it met with failure. Unfortunately, that project did not manage to either narratively articulate whether or not it was aiming at a social democratic restoration, essentially a return to the kind of politics that many people in Britain were familiar with in the 1970s and as part of the post-war consensus, essentially rolling back the erosion of some of the sort of protections that were guaranteed by the post-war consensus and the ways in which that had been wiped out by neoliberalism, or whether it was imagining something radically new and progressive. And it also never managed to resolve that tension in terms of its organizing base. It continued to largely conceive of itself as a very traditional political project, despite paying rhetorical lip service to the idea of community organizing and so on. And I note that in the chat, somebody said, you know, what are Jack's ideas about, where the kind of language that we can use to reach out to people and the kind of politics we should be pushing for, which is obviously a huge, huge question. Just very briefly, I think that vocabulary and grammar can best be found among the lived experiences of those on the margins, because it is only at the margins that you can truly understand and change the center. You know, the borderlands, if you like, help us make sense of the world at large. That's not a provincial consciousness, or certainly it's no more provincial than the kind of centre consciousness that dominates our political discourse and our media coverage of politics. And my own journalistic work has always turned in that direction. Mary alluded to this, and I'm very grateful to her for it, that in my mind, it's the very conditions of immiseration at the moment under kind of late capitalism that are opening up spaces for alternative forms of organizing. And in my most recent book, I look at that in the shape of migrant organizing amongst low-paid government cleaners forming their own trade unions. I look at tenants' unions, you know, the growing number of young people who are unable to buy their own homes, are reliant on the private rental sector, and yet are finding ways to not just organize logistically, but to conceptualize themselves as a political collective. And for me, Peadar's book was so useful and so insightful because on one level, he also gave some fantastic examples of those spaces himself, but he also brings an intellectual rigor to understanding why those spaces are important and how they come about and how they can contribute to this development of a new paradigm. He also, I think, and we've touched on this in the discussion today, it challenges the prevailing language of political discourse, and I think calls out the paucity of imagination on the part of uncritical liberal revivalists. You know, this yearning for a return to sensible governance and grown-up politics, an idea that we can just turn back the clock and put our hopes and dreams in a sort of redemptive technocratic savior in the sort of third way consensus mold. You know, quite clearly that ideology, that sort of Blairite ideology, the economic foundations for it no longer exist, but it does not have the ideological answers to the set of interconnected crises that we face today. And I'll just end on perhaps a note of caution. At the beginning of this, David mentioned that fantastic Gramsci quote about the old world dying and the new not yet being able to be born. Of course, the second half of that quote is that Gramsci mentions that in that interregnum, a great many morbid symptoms will appear. And certainly the symptoms are morbid and numerous at the moment. You know, the paradigm shift that we are to some extent living through at the moment is particularly acute because it is hopefully moving us away from neoliberal ideology, which purported to seal off areas of life from political contestation. And now politics is rushing back in to fill the vacuum. William Davies, the sociologist, talks of neoliberalism being the disenchantment of politics by economics. Well, if we're now seeing the re-enchantment of politics, the things re-enchanting it are things like place and culture and nationhood and class and race. And that opens up possibilities that are both emancipatory but also deeply revanchist. Polanyi, again, as David alluded to, knew firsthand the dangers of fascism, and you know, we are certainly across the world right now, and the scenes that we saw in January in the US remind us that that threat is not a theoretical one. It is living with us in our societies today, and one that we have to be incredibly alive to. And I think that comes back to, at the heart of Peadar's analysis, the issue of climate change and ecological justice. The longer that climate change is permitted to advance unchecked, the harder that collective solutions become to implement. And the more likely it is that a resentful, defensive, fascistic world turns in on itself. We know that unlike in Hollywood disaster films, the real danger ahead is not a total sudden collapse of humanity, but rather a slow, bitter, steadily escalating struggle over the dwindling space and resources as landscapes degrade and bits of the planet, piece by piece, gradually become uninhabitable. The apocalypse, if it comes to pass, will lie not in a human failure to adapt to climate catastrophe altogether, but in a human failure to prevent a privileged elite from asserting control over those vanishing spaces and resources and cocooning themselves off from the realms of deprivation left behind. You know, as we already have the super rich putting down payments on mountain bunkers. I'm always struck by the quote from the novelist William Gibson, who said, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." But I'll finish for real this time on a note of optimism, and that I think really speaks to many of the themes that have been brought out in this discussion today, and also of the value of Peadar's work and the way that he has brought Polanyi to bear on the moment that we are living through right now. And it's a quote from one of the organisers of the climate strikes in the UK, a young man called Jake Woodier, who's helping to coordinate the school walkouts that many young people engaged in back in 2019, partly inspired by Greta Thunberg. And I asked him what he thought about this question of whether or not we should be looking at a sort of social democratic Keynesian solution to our current problems and move away from neoliberalism, or if we should be imagining things more radically and more broadly. And this is what he said to me. He said, "The kids who are walking out of school on climate strikes have a hugely radical understanding of the way that politics works. And they recognize that our democratic processes and structures as they stand are designed to uphold the status quo. These are the children of the financial crisis who know that they will be worse off than their parents, know that they'll never own a home, and know that on current trends, they will probably live to see the end of humanity. So for them, for us, politics is not a game, it's reality. And that's reflected in the way we organize, relentlessly, radically, as if our lives depend on it. Their lives and our lives do depend on it. And in the answer to where should we be looking to develop this language of alternatives, that is my answer. You know, it's there, it's among the people who are living that reality and organizing in these spaces that are often off the radar. And I just want to thank, everyone involved today, but particularly Peadar for helping to open my eyes to those spaces and giving me the intellectual tools to understand them in a far more richer fashion. Thank you very much.
Jack, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And your concluding remarks certainly empathized with thoughts I've had myself, because I have a number of grandchildren and I think of the world that they're entering into and what it means. And I think particularly that quote you mentioned, for them, politics is reality. It's not a game. That's really a serious point. I actually was reminded, about the Third Way and that particular period by television program here last night about the Murdoch dynasty and about Blair's visit to pay homage to Rupert in Australia. How sad that looks in hindsight. But thank you, that was absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, we've gone over time. I know there are a number of other people, 7 or 8 people whose messages I didn't get to, or whose questions I didn't get to attend to, and I apologize to them. I thank Jack and Mary and Peadar particularly for their contribution. I think really, if there's one message to come out of this, actually is a positive one of hope. And that's really in assembling the argument of Polanyi in the way that he does. Peadar does give us hope for the future and for that generation of children of which you spoke, Jack. So I would really strongly recommend to everybody that they get a hold of Peadar's book and read it. And I was delighted to hear, by the way, as well, that, very well done. I was delighted to hear that Mary has a book coming out on the future of welfare, because this is something I think which is extraordinarily important. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis has exposed a lot of weaknesses in our welfare system and the need to rethink that whole idea. But I want to thank you all very much for participating. I'm delighted myself to moderate it, because I'm one of those people who have a great admiration for Peadar. I do think he's one of our great national assets here, I must say. And the longer he keeps producing these ideas for us to consider, the better, because to finally end maybe on a quote from Keynes, it's ideas that matter at the end of the day. It's ideas which are dangerous more than anything else. So thank you all indeed very much. On behalf of TASC, can I just remind everybody we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and we have a series of events going on in relation to it. The next one of which is on the 24th of March. It's a conversation with decision makers. It's with, who's it with this time? I think it's with Claire Daly. Yeah, that's right. So you're very welcome. There'll be details on the website. So you'll all be very welcome to join that. So thanks again to everybody, the panelists particularly, and everybody who sent in questions and everybody who participated in any way today. Really great to have you all. So cheerio now. Bye.